In the golden autumn of life, when most believe the chapters of romance have closed, fate writes its most extraordinary stories. Yasmin Carter, a 67-year-old literature teacher from Charleston, South Carolina, had spent 15 years honoring her late husband's memory through the books she taught and the students she inspired. Her world was one of carefully maintained routines, Sunday dinners with her grown children, and the comforting rhythm of a life well lived. She had made peace with her solitude, finding beauty in memories rather than seeking new adventures. Across the ocean, Rashid Al-Farsi, a 69-year-old self-made billionaire from Abu Dhabi, built his empire on logic, strategy, and an unwavering belief that destiny was merely a romantic notion for dreamers. Having dedicated his life to transforming his family's modest trading business into a global conglomerate, he viewed love as a distraction he could neither afford nor desire. But when a charitable foundation brings them together at a cultural exchange program in Dubai, these two souls, both convinced their stories were already written, discover that life's most profound chapters often begin when we least expect them. This is a story about second chances, the courage to open hearts thought permanently closed, and the breathtaking truth that real love recognizes no borders, no age, and no predetermined script. The morning light filtered through the antique lace curtains of Yasmin Carter's Charleston home, casting delicate patterns across the hardwood floors her late husband Thomas had refinished with his own hands 30 years ago. At 67, Yasmin maintained the graceful posture of her teaching years, her silver hair swept into an elegant chignon that framed a face marked by laugh lines and the quiet wisdom of a life fully lived. She stood in her kitchen, preparing her morning tea with the same precise movement she'd performed for decades, finding comfort in the familiar clink of china and the aromatic steam rising from her cup. The house was too large for one person, her daughter Rachel often reminded her, but Yasmin couldn't imagine leaving the walls that held 42 years of memories. Thomas's laughter echoing from the study, their children's footsteps thundering down the stairs, the countless dinner parties where literature and life intertwined in passionate discussions that lasted until dawn. Her retirement from teaching had been bittersweet, leaving behind 35 years of shaping young minds at Magnolia Preparatory School. Yet Yasmin remained active in Charleston's literary community, leading book clubs at the public library and mentoring young teachers who sought her guidance. Her children, Rachel, a physician in Boston, and Michael, an architect in Seattle, worried about her isolation, gently suggesting dating apps and senior social groups with an earnestness that made her smile. But how could she explain that her heart wasn't lonely, merely full of a love that transcended physical presence? Thomas had been her soulmate, meeting her when she was a 25-year-old graduate student, and he a charming history professor with ink-stained fingers and dreams of writing the great American novel. Their love story had been one of intellectual passion, shared values, and a partnership so complete that his death from cancer 15 years ago had felt like losing half her soul. She had grieved, healed, and built a life of purpose and contentment, never imagining that at 67 her story might contain unexpected chapters. The email that would change everything arrived that October morning as Yasmin reviewed applications for her library's winter reading program. The subject line read, "International Cultural Exchange Opportunity, Dubai Literature Festival." She almost deleted it, assuming it was spam, but something made her pause. The message was from the Emirates Global Foundation, inviting experienced educators to participate in a month-long program, bringing American and Middle Eastern literature teachers together to develop cross-cultural curriculum initiatives. The program offered full accommodations, a generous stipend, and the chance to explore Dubai's emerging literary scene while contributing to educational bridges between cultures. Yasmin's first instinct was to decline. She was too old for such adventures, too set in her ways, too comfortable in Charleston's familiar embrace. But as she reread the invitation, something stirred within her, a whisper of the adventurous young woman she'd once been, the one who'd backpacked through Europe with Thomas, debating Hemingway in Parisian cafes and reading Yeats aloud in Irish pubs. Her hand hovered over the delete button, then slowly moved to the reply field, typing words that would alter her destiny. I'm very interested in learning more about this opportunity. 9. Time zones away. Rashid Al-Farsi stood on the terrace of his penthouse office in Abu Dhabi, surveying the city his vision had helped transform. At 69, he remained an imposing figure, tall and broad-shouldered, his thick silver hair and neatly trimmed beard giving him the appearance of a distinguished statesman rather than a business magnate. His dark eyes, sharp and calculating, had evaluated countless deals, negotiations, and opportunities over 5 decades of building his empire. He wore his custom-tailored suit with the casual elegance of a man who'd long ago stopped needing to prove his status, yet his bearing commanded respect in every room he entered. The Al-Farsi group now encompassed shipping, real estate, technology ventures, and renewable energy projects across 3 continents. But Rashid remembered with perfect clarity the cramped office where he'd started with nothing but his father's failing import business and an unshakable determination to succeed beyond the limitations others tried to impose on him. Rashid's philosophy was simple. Emotion was the enemy of progress, and sentiment the luxury of those who could afford to fail. He'd built his fortune through meticulous analysis, strategic risk-taking, and an almost superhuman work ethic that left no room for distraction. Love, in his calculation, was merely a chemical reaction that clouded judgment and weakened resolve. He'd seen colleagues destroyed by divorce, friends bankrupted by romantic foolishness, and competitors conquered because their hearts overruled their heads. At 25, he'd entered an arranged marriage that produced 3 children, 2 sons now running divisions of his company, and a daughter who'd become a respected pediatric surgeon, but never evolved beyond cordial partnership. His wife Layla had passed away 8 years ago, and while he'd mourned respectfully, he'd also felt a guilty relief at no longer maintaining the pretense of a connection that had never truly existed. His children, particularly his daughter Amira, constantly urged him to find companionship, to enjoy the wealth he'd accumulated, to finally live rather than merely achieve. But Rashid couldn't comprehend what they meant. His work was his life, his empire, his legacy, and at 69 he'd made peace with a solitary existence built on accomplishment rather than affection. The Emirates Global Foundation had been his daughter Amira's idea, a way to channel some of his vast wealth toward meaningful cultural initiatives. Rashid had agreed primarily because it enhanced his corporate reputation and provided tax advantages, not from any deep belief in cultural exchange or educational idealism. He'd appointed competent directors and rarely involved himself in operational details, content to appear at annual galas and sign checks, while his attention remained focused on genuine business matters. But Amira, leveraging both her position on the foundation's board and her father's weakness for her requests, had asked him to personally host a welcoming dinner for the international educators participating in the Dubai Literature Festival program. "Just one evening, Baba," she'd pleaded in Arabic, using the childhood term that still softened his resolve. "These teachers have dedicated their lives to education. The least you can do is share one meal and show them that business leaders value culture." Rashid had agreed with reluctant grace, already planning how to minimize his time commitment while satisfying his daughter's request. He had no idea that this dinner, this obligation he viewed as tedious necessity, would introduce him to a woman who would dismantle every certainty he'd spent 69 years constructing. The Emirates flight from Atlanta to Dubai was Yasmin's first international journey in over a decade, and her first time traveling alone since Thomas's death. As the Boeing 777 climbed through cloud layers above the Atlantic, she felt a mixture of exhilaration and trepidation that reminded her of her younger self. The business class seat, a luxury provided by the foundation, cocooned her in leather and possibility as she watched the American coastline disappear beneath endless blue. Her daughter Rachel had driven down from Boston to see her off, oscillating between excitement for her mother's adventure and worry about Yasmin navigating a foreign country alone. "Mum, you have to promise to text me every day," Rachel had insisted at the airport, her physician's practicality warring with her daughter's concern. "And remember, Dubai is very different from Charleston. Just be aware of cultural differences, dress conservatively, and don't trust everyone you meet." Yasmin had smiled and kissed her daughter's cheek, touched by the role reversal that came with aging when children became parents to their own parents. During the 14-hour flight, Yasmin found herself reviewing everything she knew about Dubai and Emirati culture, which wasn't nearly as much as an educator should know before such a journey. She'd done research, of course, reading about the UAE's transformation from pearl diving villages to global metropolis, studying Islamic customs and Arabic greetings, learning about the country's emphasis on hospitality and respect. Yet facts from books couldn't prepare her for the lived experience of a culture so different. From her Southern American upbringing, the other teachers in the program, she'd connected with several via email, seemed younger and more adventurous, their messages filled with exclamation points and emojis that made Yasmin feel simultaneously ancient and charmed by their enthusiasm. There was Margaret from Oregon, a 52-year-old who taught AP literature, David from New York, a 58-year-old poetry specialist, and several others she'd meet upon arrival. Yasmin wondered if she'd made a terrible mistake, if her age and widowhood had left her too rigid for such radical change, too set in comfortable patterns to embrace genuine adventure. But as the plane began its descent into Dubai, the sunrise painted the desert landscape in shades of rose gold and amber, and something shifted in Yasmin's chest, a loosening of the tight control she'd maintained over her life since Thomas's death. Below her, she could see the impossible geometry of the city rising from sand, glass, towers catching the morning light like a forest of crystalline trees. The famous Burj Khalifa pierced the sky, and the Palm Jumeirah sprawled across turquoise waters in defiant declaration that human imagination could reshape even nature itself. It was beautiful and alien, and thrilling in ways Yasmin hadn't allowed herself to feel in 15 years. As the wheels touched down and the pilot welcomed them to Dubai in both Arabic and English, Yasmin made a silent promise to herself and to Thomas's memory. She would be open to this experience, would honor the adventurous spirit they'd shared, would say yes to possibility rather than retreating into safe, familiar refusal. She had no idea that this promise would lead her to a man who'd spent his entire life saying no to the very things she was learning to embrace, or that their collision would create something neither logic nor literature could have predicted. The welcoming dinner at Rashid's private estate in Emirates Hills was an exercise in understated opulence that left Yasmin breathless. She'd been collected from her hotel with the other educators by a fleet of Mercedes sedans that glided through Dubai's pristine streets, past architectural marvels that seemed to compete for attention against the twilight sky. The Al-Farsi residence sat behind high walls draped with bougainvillea, its modern Arabian architecture blending traditional elements with contemporary luxury in ways Yasmin's architect son would have studied for hours. The entrance courtyard featured a fountain whose geometric Islamic patterns created mesmerizing water displays, while the scent of jasmine and rose hung heavy in the warm evening air. Inside, the home revealed itself as a museum-quality collection of art and culture, contemporary Middle Eastern paintings alongside ancient artifacts, floor-to-ceiling windows offering views of Dubai's glittering skyline, and furnishings that managed to be both palatial and somehow intimate. Yet despite the overwhelming beauty, Yasmin felt surprisingly comfortable, perhaps because of the genuine warmth radiating from Amira Al-Farsi, who greeted each educator personally with gracious hospitality that transcended mere politeness. Rashid arrived 30 minutes late, his entrance deliberate and commanding, even as he apologized for his tardiness in accented but perfect English. Yasmin noticed him immediately, not because of his obvious wealth or authority, but because of the careful distance he maintained, even while performing hospitality. He moved through the gathering with practiced efficiency, shaking hands, making appropriate small talk, his smile never quite reaching those analytical dark eyes. When he reached Yasmin, she extended her hand with southern graciousness and introduced herself, mentioning her 35 years teaching American literature in Charleston. Something flickered across his face. Interest, surprise, before the professional mask returned. "Charleston is one of your country's most beautiful cities," he said, his voice deep and measured, "rich in history and literature. Have you read the works of Josephine Humphreys? I found her understanding of your city quite profound." Yasmin was startled. She'd expected polite platitudes, not genuine literary knowledge from a billionaire businessman. "I have," she replied, matching his formal tone despite her surprise. "Though I find Pat Conroy's work captures the Southern Gothic tradition with more emotional authenticity." Rashid's eyebrow lifted slightly, and for the first time that evening, his smile seemed almost genuine. "An interesting assessment. I would argue Conroy sometimes indulges sentiment at the expense of narrative discipline, but perhaps that's a cultural difference in appreciation." The dinner that followed was served in a formal dining room where crystal chandeliers cast rainbow prisms across damask tablecloths and porcelain that probably cost more than Yasmin's annual teacher pension. The meal itself was an elegant fusion of traditional Emirati cuisine and international dishes, each course presented with artistic precision. Yasmin found herself seated between David, the poetry teacher from New York, and an empty chair that remained vacant until Rashid, abandoning his position at the head of the table, moved to occupy it. "I hope you don't mind," he said, his formality softening slightly, "but I find myself curious about your perspective on Conroy. It's rare to meet someone willing to challenge conventional literary wisdom." What began as polite dinner conversation evolved into an engaged debate about American Southern literature, its relationship to regional identity, and the ways trauma and memory shape narrative voice. Yasmin was surprised by Rashid's depth of knowledge. He'd clearly read extensively in American literature, could quote passages from memory, and possessed analytical skills that rivaled her most gifted students. More surprising was the way he listened, truly listened, considering her arguments before responding rather than simply waiting for his turn to speak. By the time dessert arrived, an exquisite saffron-infused crème brûlée alongside traditional Arabic sweets, they'd moved beyond literature to discussing education philosophy, the challenges of teaching across cultural divides, and the ways personal experience shaped interpretation of text. Across the table, Amira watched her father with barely concealed astonishment, having never seen him so animated in social conversation. The Literature Festival program consumed Yasmin's days with workshops, cultural experiences, and collaborative curriculum development that challenged her assumptions about education and cultural exchange. She toured the Dubai Public Library, visited traditional souks, where the scent of spices and the calls of merchants created sensory overload, and participated in roundtable discussions with Emirati educators who shared their perspectives on teaching in a rapidly modernizing society. The other American teachers were wonderful colleagues, but Yasmin found herself thinking repeatedly about her conversation with Rashid Al-Farsi, puzzling over the contradiction between his reputation as a ruthless businessman and the thoughtful, literary mind she'd encountered at dinner. She told herself it was intellectual curiosity, nothing more. She was too old and too devoted to Thomas's memory to feel anything resembling attraction. Yet when her phone chimed with an unexpected message 3 days after the dinner, her heart performed a small, traitorous leap. "Mrs. Carter, this is Rashid Al-Farsi. I hope you don't mind that I obtained your contact information from the foundation. I'm reaching out because I've been thinking about our conversation regarding Pat Conroy, and I wonder if you might be willing to continue that discussion over coffee. I know this is highly irregular, but I find myself genuinely curious about your literary perspective. Rashid." Yasmin stared at the message for a full minute, her teacher's mind analyzing grammar and word choice, while her woman's heart registered the vulnerability beneath the formal language. She should decline, she thought. This was inappropriate. She was here for professional reasons, and whatever this was could only complicate her experience. Besides, what did she know about this man beyond one evening's conversation? He could have any number of motives, none of them honorable. Charleston friends had warned her about men taking advantage of women traveling alone, about scams targeting seniors, about the importance of maintaining proper boundaries. Yet something in his message felt genuine, almost tentative, as if the man who commanded billions found himself uncertain about a simple coffee invitation. Yasmin thought of Thomas, of how he'd always encouraged her to seize unexpected opportunities, to trust her instincts about people's character. She thought of her promise to herself on the plane, to be open, to embrace possibility, to honor the adventurous spirit she'd once possessed. Her fingers typed a response before caution could override courage. Mr. Al-Farsi, I would enjoy continuing our literary discussion. However, I prefer tea to coffee. Let me know when and where. Their meeting took place at a traditional Arabic cafe in the Al-Fahidi historical district, far from the glittering towers and tourist crowds. Rashid had chosen carefully, Yasmin realized, selecting a location that offered both cultural authenticity and a certain anonymity. The cafe was frequented by locals, artists and writers, rather than businessmen and society figures. He arrived dressed more casually than at the dinner, in dark slacks and a crisp white shirt, and stood when she entered, his manners old world in their courtesy. They ordered tea, mint for him, chamomile for her, and fell into conversation as naturally as long-time friends rather than near strangers from opposite ends of the world. Rashid asked about her teaching career, and Yasmin found herself sharing stories she hadn't told in years. The student who'd discovered her voice through poetry after years of selective mutism, the class that read To Kill a Mockingbird and organized a community initiative against local injustice, the profound privilege of watching young minds expand through literature's power. In turn, Rashid spoke of his business not in terms of profit margins and market dominance, but as a form of creation, building something from nothing, employing thousands of families, providing opportunities where none existed. As afternoon light slanted through the cafe's mashrabia screens, creating geometric shadows across their table, Yasmin realized they were both, in their own ways, educators, teaching through different methods but sharing a fundamental belief in growth, possibility and legacy. Over the following 2 weeks, Yasmin and Rashid fell into an unexpected rhythm. He would message her each morning with a literary question or quote, and she would respond with her own challenge or observation. Their exchanges were intellectual duels that somehow felt like intimate conversations, debating whether tragic endings were more honest than happy ones, analyzing the role of place in shaping character, exploring how memory distorts narrative truth. They met for tea 3 more times, each conversation ranging far beyond literature into philosophy, faith, cultural difference, and the ways life had shaped their respective worldviews. Rashid told her about building his empire from his father's failing business, about the loneliness of decision-making when thousands depended on your choices being correct, about the strange emptiness of achieving every goal you'd set. Yasmin shared her grief journey after Thomas's death, the way teaching had saved her when sorrow threatened to consume everything, the quiet contentment she'd built from accepting that her great love story was complete. Neither acknowledged the growing intimacy of their connection, both maintaining careful distance even as that distance steadily eroded. The other teachers had begun to notice Yasmin's frequent absences and the way her phone drew her attention during sessions. Margaret from Oregon, finally, confronted her during a break in a curriculum workshop, her expression more amused than concerned. "So who is he?" she asked directly, making Yasmin blush like a schoolgirl. "There's no he," Yasmin protested, then reconsidered. "Well, there's someone I've been having interesting conversations with, but it's purely intellectual. We're discussing literature and culture, nothing more." Margaret's knowing smile was infuriating. "Honey, I've been married 30 years and I can tell you that the most dangerous affairs start exactly like that, with just talking. Not that I'm judging," she added quickly. "You're a grown woman, and you deserve happiness. Just be careful. Dubai may be modern, but it's still the Middle East, and you're still a guest in someone else's country. Cultural complications can get messy fast." Yasmin assured her friend there was nothing to worry about, but Margaret's words planted seeds of doubt. Was she being naive? Was she misreading friendship as something more? And most troubling, did she want it to be something more? That night, lying in her hotel room with the Dubai skyline glittering beyond floor-to-ceiling windows, Yasmin faced a truth she'd been avoiding. She was developing feelings for Rashid Al-Farsi, feelings that transcended intellectual admiration and cultural curiosity. At 67, she found herself experiencing the nervous anticipation of waiting for his messages, the joy of making him laugh, the way her skin hummed with awareness when he sat close enough that she could smell his cologne, something woody and expensive that made her think of distant forests and unexplored territories. It was ridiculous, she told herself. They lived on opposite sides of the world, came from radically different cultures, and she was too old for such foolishness. More importantly, she'd promised herself and Thomas's memory that she'd never love again, that the space he'd occupied in her heart would remain sacred and untouched. Yet here she was, at an age when most people were content with grandchildren and early bird specials, feeling emotions she'd thought permanently buried with her husband. The guilt was overwhelming, but beneath it ran something else, a thin stream of possibility, fragile as spider silk but growing stronger each day. Yasmin had always taught her students that literature's power lay in its ability to show us that life contained more possibilities than we imagined, that stories could reshape our understanding of what was true and what was possible. Now life was teaching her that lesson, and she wasn't sure she was brave enough to learn it. Rashid prided himself on self-awareness, on understanding his own motivations with the same analytical clarity he brought to business decisions. So he couldn't comprehend why he found himself rearranging his schedule to accommodate tea meetings with an American teacher, or why her messages made him smile like a fool in the middle of board meetings, or why her opinions on long-dead authors mattered more than billion-dollar contracts. He'd spent 69 years building walls between himself and emotional vulnerability, convinced that sentiment was weakness and attachment was liability. Yet Yasmin Carter slipped past his defenses with the quiet inevitability of dawn breaking, and he was powerless to stop it even as he recognized what was happening. She challenged him constantly, not confrontationally, but with gentle questions that exposed flaws in his logical arguments, with perspectives that revealed blind spots in his worldview, with a grace and intelligence that made him want to be better than the calculating machine he'd perfected himself into becoming. When she spoke about her late husband, her eyes held such love and loss that Rashid felt simultaneously jealous of a dead man and humbled by the depth of devotion Thomas Carter had inspired. This, he realized, with growing panic, was what he'd spent his life avoiding, the magnificent, terrifying vulnerability of caring more about someone else's happiness than his own strategic interests. The evening everything changed began innocuously enough. Rashid had invited Yasmin to attend a private gallery opening featuring contemporary Middle Eastern women artists, assuring her that several other foundation guests would attend and that his daughter Amira would join them. Yasmin arrived wearing a modest but elegant navy dress that made her silver hair shine like moonlight, and Rashid felt his carefully maintained composure threatened to crumble. The gallery was in DIFC, Dubai's financial district, a modern space with soaring ceilings where abstract paintings and mixed media installations explored themes of identity, tradition, and change. Rashid watched Yasmin move through the exhibits with complete absorption, reading every placard, studying each piece with the focused attention she probably brought to her students' work. At one installation, a haunting piece exploring displacement and belonging, she stood so long in contemplation that Rashid approached with concern. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly. Yasmin turned to him, and he was startled to see tears tracking down her cheeks. "This piece," she said, gesturing to the artwork. "It reminds me that I've been in exile too, just not geographically. I've been exiled from myself, from the woman I was before. Thomas died. I've been living as a memorial to our love, rather than living an actual life." Rashid found himself doing something completely out of character. He took her hand, there in the public gallery with other guests milling around, and he didn't care who saw or what they thought. "Yasmin," he said, using her first name for the first time, dropping the formal Mrs. Carter that had maintained safe distance between them. "I don't believe in fate or destiny. I built my entire life on the principle that we create our own reality through discipline and strategic decision-making. But meeting you has made me question everything I thought I knew with certainty." He paused, aware that he stood at a crossroads where his next words would alter both their lives irrevocably. "I think about you constantly. I rearrange international conference calls to have tea with you. I read poetry at 2 in the morning because you mentioned loving a particular verse. I'm 70 years old, and I'm experiencing something I've successfully avoided my entire life. I think I'm falling in love with you, and I have absolutely no idea what to do about it." The confession hung in the air between them, both magnificent and terrible in its honesty. Around them, the gallery continued its sophisticated hum of conversation and clinking wine glasses, but in their small corner of space, time seemed suspended. Yasmin stared at him, her expression cycling through shock, confusion, and something that looked like longing before settling into sadness. "Rashid, you don't love me. You love the idea of me, the novelty, the intellectual connection. In 3 weeks I return to Charleston, and you'll return to your empire and your world, and this will become a pleasant memory of an interesting interlude." Her voice was gentle but firm, the teacher's tone she'd used countless times to deliver difficult truths to students who needed to hear them. "Besides, I made a promise to myself and to Thomas that I wouldn't dishonor our love by trying to replace him. What we had was once in a lifetime. I can't and won't diminish that by pretending I can feel that way again." Rashid absorbed her words, analyzing them with the same acuity he brought to complex negotiations, and recognized the fear beneath her logic. Not fear of him, but fear of betraying a ghost, of discovering that love could exist beyond what she'd thought was its final chapter. He released. Her hand stepped back to provide the physical distance that matched her emotional retreat, and made a decision that went against every instinct honed over decades of winning through persistence and strategy. "I understand," he said quietly. "I apologize for making you uncomfortable. Perhaps we should return to the reception." As they rejoined the crowd, both carrying their separate turmoil beneath socially acceptable masks, neither noticed Rashid Al-Farsi watching them with the knowing smile of someone who recognized love even when the lovers themselves refused to acknowledge it. Yasmin threw herself into the program's remaining activities with desperate determination, volunteering for every optional excursion and staying late at every workshop to avoid the solitude where Rashid's confession would demand acknowledgement. She stopped responding to his morning messages, deleted his texts unread, and declined the tea invitation he sent with heartbreaking formality through the foundation coordinator. Margaret and David noticed her forced cheerfulness and knew better than to probe, offering supportive presence without demanding explanations. But at night, in her luxury hotel room that suddenly felt like a prison, Yasmin couldn't escape the truth Margaret had identified weeks ago. She'd fallen in love with Rashid Al-Farsi, and it terrified her more than anything she'd experienced since watching Thomas take his last labored breath. The betrayal she felt wasn't toward Rashid's honesty, but toward her own heart, for daring to feel something she'd promised would remain exclusively reserved for a man 15 years in his grave. She'd built her entire identity as Thomas's widow, the woman who'd had her great love and needed nothing more. What did it mean about her devotion if she could feel this way about someone else? What did it say about the epic romance she'd believed was unrepeatable if it could be repeated? Rashid responded to Yasmin's withdrawal exactly as one might expect from a man who'd mastered control in all areas of his life. He buried himself in work, scheduled back-to-back meetings across 3 time zones, and flew to London for a merger negotiation that could easily have been handled by his acquisitions team. His children noticed his increased irritability and the way he'd aged a decade in days. Amira confronted him in his office late one evening, finding him staring at a first edition of The Prince of Tides he'd purchased impulsively after a literary discussion with Yasmin. "Baba," she said in Arabic, using the loving familiarity that granted her special access, "you're miserable. Anyone with eyes can see it, and that American teacher is equally miserable, according to the foundation coordinator I had lunch with today. So what happened? And more importantly, what are you going to do about it?" Rashid tried to dismiss her concern, but Amira was her father's daughter in persistence and perception. Under her gentle interrogation, the story emerged. His unprecedented confession, Yasmin's refusal, the impasse of 2 people who'd spent their lives mastering control, suddenly confronted with emotions that refused containment. "She's right, you know," Amira said thoughtfully after hearing everything. "You are just getting to know each other. 3 weeks isn't enough time to build something real. But Baba, what if you gave it more time? What if she didn't? Return to America in 10 days. What if you actually pursued this like it mattered?" Rashid shook his head, his expression weary. "Amira, Habibti, she made her position clear. She loved her husband deeply, and she's not interested in trying to recreate that connection with someone else. I respect her loyalty, even as He trailed off, unable to complete the thought. His daughter studied him with the clinical assessment she brought to diagnosing complex medical cases. "You know what I think? I think you're both running scared because loving someone at your age means confronting mortality and vulnerability and all the things you've spent your lives trying to control. You're afraid of losing again, and she's afraid that loving you means her first love wasn't as unique as she needed it to be. But here's the truth, Baba. Love doesn't diminish by being shared. The heart doesn't have limited capacity. Her loving you wouldn't mean she loved her husband less. It would just mean she's brave enough to love again." Her words hung in the air like a challenge, and Rashid found himself considering possibilities he'd dismissed as impossibilities. Before he could respond, his phone chimed with a calendar reminder. Yasmin's flight back to Atlanta departed in 10 days, and he had exactly that long to decide whether he was the calculating machine he'd always believed himself to be, or the man of unexpected courage Yasmin made him want to become. What Rashid planned wasn't a typical grand romantic gesture, no flash mobs or skywriting or public declarations. Instead, he did something far more personal and terrifying. He arranged for Yasmin to receive something that revealed the depth of his attention and understanding. Through the foundation coordinator and judicious application of his influence, he learned about Yasmin's final project presentation. Each educator would share their experience and the curriculum initiatives they'd developed to take back to their institutions. Rashid attended, sitting in the back row of the conference room, while Yasmin presented her work, a cross-cultural literature program pairing American Southern Gothic with contemporary Middle Eastern fiction, exploring themes of place, memory, and identity across cultural divides. Her presentation was brilliant, passionate, and so distinctly her that Rashid felt his chest constrict with something he couldn't name. Pride, longing, the recognition that this woman had become essential to his understanding of what life could be. When she finished to enthusiastic applause, their eyes met across the room, and the connection was electric, undeniable, and utterly terrifying to them both. After the presentations concluded, the foundation coordinator approached Yasmin with a thick envelope bearing the Al-Farsi group seal. "This was delivered for you," she said with a knowing smile. Inside, Yasmin found a letter in Rashid's bold, elegant handwriting, actual handwriting, not typed text, the kind of personal communication that felt almost archaeological in the digital age. "Dear Yasmin," it began, "you told me you don't believe we can build something real in 3 weeks. and you're probably right. You told me you loved your husband too much to dishonor his memory with another relationship, and I respect your loyalty even as I question your conclusion. But what you didn't tell me, what I don't think you've admitted even to yourself, is that you're afraid. Afraid that loving me would mean your love for Thomas wasn't unique. Afraid that your identity as his widow would lose meaning if you became someone's partner again. Afraid that at 67 you don't have the energy or courage for the vulnerability that real love demands. I understand these fears because I share them. At 69, I've built my entire identity on being self-sufficient, on not needing anyone or anything beyond my work and my legacy. You've made me question every assumption I've held sacred. The letter continued for 3 pages, and with each paragraph, Yasmin felt her carefully constructed defenses crumbling. Rashid wrote about the difference between replacing and honoring, about how loving again didn't diminish what came before, but rather testified to the human heart's remarkable capacity for resilience and renewal. He wrote about his empty marriage and how meeting her had shown him what connection could actually mean. Not duty or partnership or comfortable coexistence, but genuine recognition of another's soul. He wrote about fear and courage, about the difference between existing and truly living, about how they'd both spent years building beautiful prisons from their respective losses and accomplishments. I'm not asking you to stay in Dubai, his letter concluded. I'm not asking you to abandon your life in Charleston or to choose between me and Thomas's memory. I'm asking you to consider that maybe life has more chapters than you thought, and maybe the story you believed was finished is actually just beginning a new volume. I'm asking for the chance to build something real, which means taking the time to actually know each other beyond these intense 3 weeks. Give me 6 months. 6 months of video calls and letters, and me visiting Charleston and you returning to Dubai. 6 months to discover if this connection we feel is sustainable beyond the artificial intensity of this program. If at the end of that time you still feel it's impossible or unwise or disloyal to Thomas's memory, I'll accept your decision and we'll remain friends, if such a thing is possible for 2 people like us. But Yasmin, please don't run from this out of fear disguised as loyalty. Your husband loved you enough to want you to live, truly live, even after he was gone. I believe that because I recognize the quality of his character in the woman he loved. With a profound respect and honest affection, Rashid. Yasmin read the letter 3 times, tears flowing freely by the end, and felt something shift fundamentally in her understanding of herself and her future. She'd been using Thomas's memory as both shield and prison, keeping herself safe from hurt, but also from joy, from risk, from life itself. She'd turned their love into a monument, beautiful and unchanging, but ultimately lifeless, when Thomas would have wanted her to carry their love forward into new experiences, new connections, new chapters. She thought of something he'd said during his final weeks, when the cancer pain was managed enough for conversation, but they both knew time was limited. "Yaz," he'd said, using his special nickname for her, "promise me you won't stop living when I'm gone. Promise me you'll find joy and adventure and maybe even love again, because what we had was special, but it doesn't have to be the end of your story. Let it be the foundation for everything that comes next," she'd promised, holding his hand while machines beeped their mechanical symphony, but she'd broken that promise, she realized now. She'd spent 15 years maintaining a memorial when she should have been building a life that honored both what she'd lost and what might still be possible. Looking at Rashid's letter, feeling the weight of his understanding and the courage of his honesty, Yasmin made a decision that terrified and exhilarated her in equal measure. She pulled out her phone and typed a message with shaking hands. "Yes, 6 months. Let's see where this story goes." The final 3 days of Yasmin's Dubai visit transformed from awkward avoidance into careful exploration of what they might become. Rashid and Yasmin met for breakfast the morning after her acceptance, and the relief in his dark eyes when he saw her walking toward his table made her heart perform acrobatics her 67-year-old chest shouldn't be capable of. They talked for hours, this time not about literature or abstract philosophy, but about practical realities. What 6 months of long-distance exploration collaboration would look like, how they'd navigate the geographic and cultural gaps, what they each needed to feel secure in this unprecedented situation. Rashid was remarkably forthcoming about his concerns, that he'd never been good at relationships, that his controlling nature might overwhelm her independence, that his business obligations meant he couldn't always prioritize their connection the way it deserved. Yasmin matched his honesty with her own fears, that she'd compare him unfairly to Thomas, that her age and set ways would make compromise difficult, that her children might react badly to her pursuing romance with a Muslim billionaire from the Middle East. Speaking these fears aloud somehow diminished their power, and by the time they finished their meal, both felt cautiously optimistic about their agreement. The foundation organized a farewell dinner for the departing educators, and this time Rashid attended not as obligated host, but as genuine participant, sitting beside Yasmin throughout the evening with a subtle protectiveness that didn't go unnoticed by the other guests. Margaret caught Yasmin's eye across the table and raised her wine glass in a silent toast that said, "I told you so," with loving vindication. When it was time for goodbye speeches, Yasmin thanked the foundation and her fellow educators, but found herself speaking unexpected words. "I came to Dubai to learn about cultural exchange and curriculum development, and I'm leaving with so much more than I anticipated. This experience reminded me that we're never too old for transformation, that home isn't just a place, but a feeling of belonging we can create anywhere, and that the stories we tell ourselves about who we are and what we're capable of are always more limited than the truth of what life offers. Thank you for teaching me to rewrite my own narrative." The applause that followed felt like benediction, and when Rashid reached over to briefly squeeze her hand beneath the table, Yasmin felt simultaneously frightened and more alive than she'd been in 15 years. The airport goodbye was more difficult than either expected. Standing in the departures terminal of Dubai International, surrounded by thousands of travelers beginning their own journeys, Rashid and Yasmin faced each other with the awkwardness of people navigating undefined territory. They weren't quite lovers, weren't simply friends, weren't anything with clear boundaries or established protocols. "I'll call you when I land in Charleston," Yasmin promised, her voice thick with emotion, "and I'll bore you with descriptions of how inadequate Atlanta's airport is compared to Dubai's," she added with forced lightness. Rashid smiled, and this time it reached his eyes, transforming his austere features into something warm and wonderful. "I'll look forward to being bored by you for the next 6 months," he replied. Then, surprising them both, he pulled her into an embrace that was both chaste and charged with promise, his chin resting briefly on her silver hair, while she felt the solid reality of his chest against her cheek. "Safe travels, ya Hayati," he murmured in Arabic, and though Yasmin didn't understand the words, she understood the meaning. Something precious, acknowledged, something significant beginning. As she walked towards security, she turned back once to see him still standing there, watching her with an expression of vulnerable hope that made her certain she was making the right choice, terrifying as it was. The first month of video calls was simultaneously wonderful and frustrating. Technology connected them across time zones. Yasmin's morning coffee aligned with Rashid's late evening tea, and they'd spend an hour before her teaching, obligations, and after his business meetings sharing their days. She showed him Charleston through her laptop camera, walking through the historic district while narrating architectural history, introducing him via screen to her favorite bookstore's owner and the librarian who coordinated her reading groups. He reciprocated by giving her virtual tours of his various offices, introducing her to his assistant Nadia, who clearly thought her boss had lost his mind but was too professional to say so, and showing her the private library in his home where he did his serious reading, floor-to-ceiling shelves holding literature in Arabic, English, French, and German, a collection that rivaled some university libraries. But screens couldn't convey touch, couldn't deliver the subtle chemistry of physical presence, couldn't fully capture the nuances of expression that defined real connection. They both felt the limitation acutely, even as they grew to know each other's daily Rhythms, habits, frustrations, and small joys. The real test came when Yasmin had to tell her children. She'd been dreading this conversation, unsure how Rachel and Michael would react to their mother pursuing romance with a Muslim businessman from the Middle East. She invited them both for Thanksgiving, a month after returning from Dubai, and prepared her announcement with the same careful planning she'd once brought to parent-teacher conferences about difficult students. Rachel arrived first, immediately noticing something different about her mother, a lightness, an energy, a return of the sparkle that had died with their father. "Mom, you look wonderful," she said with physician's assessment. "Whatever you're doing, keep doing it." That opening made Yasmin's confession easier. She explained about meeting Rashid, about their growing connection, about the 6-month exploration they'd agreed upon. Rachel's reaction was more positive than Yasmin dared. Hope, professional curiosity about cross-cultural relationships, concern about geographic distance, but ultimately supportive happiness that her mother was opening herself to possibility. Michael's response was more complicated, colored by protective instincts and perhaps some resentment that his father was being replaced. It took an emotional conversation where Yasmin explained that loving Rashid didn't diminish her love for Thomas before her son reluctantly accepted her new relationship. By the end of Thanksgiving weekend, both children had agreed to video call with Rashid, an awkward but necessary first step in integrating her two worlds. In Abu Dhabi, Rashid's revelation to his own children went both better and worse than anticipated. His sons, busy with their own families and business responsibilities, responded with polite disinterest as long as their father remained competent in business matters. But Amira, whom he told first and in person, reacted with such joy that Rashid felt simultaneously validated and exposed. "Baba, I'm so proud of you," she said, tears streaming down her cheeks. "After Mama died, I was so worried you'd just work yourself to death, that you'd never let anyone in. Yasmin must be extraordinary." She insisted on video calling Yasmin immediately, and the conversation between the two women, his sophisticated daughter who treated trauma patients with equal parts skill and compassion, and the Southern literature teacher who'd somehow cracked his carefully constructed defenses, filled Rashid with a contentment he'd never experienced even in his greatest business triumphs. Watching Amira and Yasmin laugh together about his stubborn nature and his tendency to intellectualize emotions, Rashid glimpsed what his life might become, not the solitary pursuit of achievement, but a rich tapestry of connection and shared experience. The vision was both intoxicating and terrifying, particularly when Amira ended the call and looked at him with her mother's shrewd perception. "Don't mess this up, Baba," she warned lovingly. "That woman is your second chance. Don't let fear or control or your need to have everything perfectly planned destroy what could be the best chapter of your life." 3 months into their 6-month agreement, Rashid flew to Charleston for a week-long visit that would test whether their connection could survive the translation from screen to reality. Yasmin was a nervous wreck preparing for his arrival, cleaning her home obsessively, meal planning with absurd precision, second-guessing every decision about itinerary and logistics. Margaret, who'd become both confident and cheerleader, finally took her hands and said firmly, "Honey, he's not coming to inspect your housekeeping. He's coming to see you. Just be yourself, show him your world, and trust that whatever happens is what's supposed to happen." Yasmin collected Rashid from Charleston International Airport on a crisp February morning, her heart thundering as she watched him emerge from customs, looking simultaneously distinguished and uncertain in a black cashmere coat and dark jeans that were more casual than she'd ever seen him. The first hug felt both familiar and awkward, their bodies remembering what screens couldn't convey, but also navigating months of separation and built-up expectation. The drive to her home filled with nervous chatter about his flight and her apologetic explanations about Charleston's size compared to Dubai, until Rashid gently placed his hand over hers on the gear shift and said, "Yasmin, breathe. We're just two people getting to know each other. Let's not make it more complicated than that." Showing Rashid, her world felt more intimate than Yasmin had anticipated. He moved through her home with genuine interest, studying the photographs that chronicled her life, wedding pictures of a young Yasmin and Thomas, their children at various ages, family vacations and milestone moments that told the story of a marriage well lived. She watched him examine these artifacts of her past with something like trepidation, waiting for jealousy or discomfort that never came. Instead, Rashid asked questions about Thomas, about their relationship, about the life they'd built together, with such sincere interest that Yasmin felt the last of her guilt dissolve. This man wasn't threatened by her past or demanding she pretend it didn't exist. He was honoring it as the foundation that had shaped the woman he'd come to care for. They toured Charleston's historic sites, walked through her beloved bookstore, where she introduced him to the staff like they were family, and attended her library reading group, where Rashid charmed a room full of Southern women by passionately defending Elizabeth Bennet's choices in Pride and Prejudice. Watching him engage with her community, seeing him fit into her world. Despite their vast differences, Yasmin felt hope bloom that maybe this impossible thing might actually be possible. The intimacy of daily routines proved more revealing than grand gestures. Rashid insisted on cooking dinner one evening, traditional Emirati mashboos that filled her kitchen with spices and made her neighborhood smell like a Dubai souk. Yasmin watched him move confidently around her stove, impressed and touched that this billionaire businessman knew his way around a kitchen. "My mother insisted all her children learn to cook," he explained, stirring rice with the same focused attention he probably brought to business negotiations. She said, depending on others for basic needs created dangerous vulnerability. Over that meal, eaten at her small kitchen table rather than any formal dining room, they talked about their respective marriages with the honesty that 3 months of video calls and thousands of text messages had built. Rashid admitted that his marriage to Layla had been arrangement rather than romance, respectful but never truly intimate. Yasmin shared that while she and Thomas had experienced deep love, they'd also faced challenges. His drinking problem early in their marriage, her struggle with postpartum depression after Michael's birth, the normal complications that accompany decades together. "I think I've idealized our relationship in memory," she confessed. "Made it more perfect than it was, maybe because I needed to believe the pain of losing him had equal measure in what we'd shared." Rashid reached across the table, taking her hand with a naturalness that hadn't existed when he'd arrived. "All love deserves idealization in memory," he said gently, "but maybe it also deserves to be remembered as fully human, perfect and flawed, just like us." The week in Charleston ended too quickly, and as Rashid prepared to return to Abu Dhabi, both felt the clock ticking on their 6-month agreement. 3 months completed, 3 remaining. They'd proven their connection could survive geographic translation, but they'd also confronted the practical impossibilities of building a life together. Yasmin's roots ran deep in Charleston. Her children, her grandchildren, her friends, her community identity were all here. Rashid's empire required his presence in the Middle East, and despite modern technology's illusion of borderless business, certain decisions demanded face-to-face negotiation and cultural navigation that couldn't be outsourced. The night before his departure, they sat on Yasmin's porch swing, the February chill requiring blankets and proximity for warmth. "What do we do if this works?" Yasmin asked quietly. "What does our life look like if we decide we want to be together?" "I can't move to Abu Dhabi, Rashid. I'm too old to start over in a completely foreign culture. My family is here, my identity is here, but I can't ask you to abandon everything you've built either." Rashid was silent for a long moment, his arm around her shoulders, both of them swaying gently on the porch swing. "I don't have answers," he admitted finally. "For the first time in my life, I'm facing a problem I can't solve through strategy or resources or sheer determination. But I know I don't want to lose you, so we'll figure something out." But doubt crept in during the 3 weeks following Rashid's departure. The return to video calls felt inadequate after experiencing his physical presence, and the geographic impossibility of their situation weighed heavily on both. Yasmin found herself withdrawing, responding less frequently to his messages. citing school obligations and fatigue. In truth, she was protecting herself, building walls again, because the alternative, fully committing to a relationship with no clear path forward, felt like setting herself up for inevitable heartbreak. Rashid, in turn, threw himself into a major acquisition that required round-the-clock attention, using work as both distraction and justification for his own emotional retreat. Their video calls became shorter, more stilted, the easy intimacy they'd built eroding under the weight of unspoken fear and logistical reality. Margaret noticed Yasmin's withdrawal and confronted her after a library board meeting. "You're running again," she said bluntly, "just like you did in Dubai. You're finding reasons to push him away because you're scared it might actually work, and then you'd have to make impossible choices." Yasmin couldn't deny it because Margaret was absolutely right. She was sabotaging what might be her last chance at love because staying safe felt better than risking everything and potentially losing. The crisis came via an unexpected source. Rachel called one evening in tears, her typically composed physician's demeanor shattered by news that her marriage of 23 years was ending. Her husband had been having an affair, and the betrayal had destroyed Rachel's trust and her belief in lasting love. Yasmin flew to Boston immediately, and over 3 days of supporting her daughter through the initial shock and pain, she saw her own situation with new clarity. Rachel kept saying she should have seen the signs, should have protected herself better, should never have been vulnerable enough for this level of hurt. "Maybe Dad had the right idea," Rachel said bitterly. "Dying first before disappointment could poison everything." Yasmin held her daughter and recognized the defensive thinking. Better to avoid love than risk loss. Better to stay safe than chance devastation. It was exactly the logic Yasmin had been applying to her relationship with Rashid, and seeing it reflected in her daughter's pain revealed its fundamental flaw. Love wasn't a strategic decision to be calculated based on risk assessment and potential return on investment. It was a leap of faith, an act of courage that required accepting vulnerability as the price of connection. Thomas hadn't played it safe when he'd fallen in love with a graduate student still finding her voice. He'd risked rejection, invested his heart, and created something worth the inevitable pain when death separated them. Was Yasmin dishonoring his memory by refusing to take similar risks now, or was she dishonoring it by treating their love as so fragile that new love could diminish it? Flying back to Charleston, Yasmin made a decision that terrified her. She would tell Rashid the complete truth about her fears, her withdrawal, and what she needed for their relationship to work. No more protective retreat, no more strategic distance, just honest vulnerability regardless of outcome. She called him as soon as she got home, and they talked for 3 hours. Raw, difficult, occasionally painful conversation where both admitted their failures and fears. Yasmin confessed she'd been sabotaging their connection because she was terrified of the choices real commitment would require. Rashid admitted he'd been using work as excuse to avoid confronting the same fears. They talked about Rachel's marriage crisis and how it had forced Yasmin to examine her own defensive patterns. They talked about risk and courage, about the difference between protecting yourself and imprisoning yourself, about how love required the willingness to potentially lose everything as the price of gaining anything. "I'm 67 years old," Yasmin said, tears streaming down her face, "and I've spent the last 15 years playing it safe, pretending I was honoring Thomas when really I was just scared. I don't want to waste whatever time I have left being scared. I want to be brave enough to love you, Rashid, even if I don't know how to make the logistics work." Rashid was quiet for so long, Yasmin feared the connection had dropped. Then he said, "I've been thinking about something Amira told me after she met you. She said the heart doesn't have limited capacity, that loving you wouldn't diminish anything else I've built or anyone else I've loved. I think that's true for you too, Yasmin. Loving me doesn't diminish what you had with Thomas. It just means you're brave enough to let your heart expand rather than contract." He paused, then continued with uncharacteristic uncertainty. "I have a proposal, and I want you to really consider it before responding. What if we split our time? What if I purchased a home in Charleston, and we lived there 6 months of the year, and you came to Abu Dhabi for the other 6 months? My sons can handle more of the business operations. They're ready, and I've been too controlling to let them prove it. You're retired from full-time teaching, so you have flexibility. It wouldn't be perfect or easy, but it would be possible. We could build a life that honors both our communities, both our families, both our identities. We could be together without either of us having to completely abandon everything we've built. What do you think? The proposal was so practical, yet so radical, that Yasmin found herself laughing and crying simultaneously. It would mean giving up the illusion of settled permanence she'd clung to since Thomas's death. It would mean explaining to her children and friends that at 67 she was embarking on a bi-coastal international relationship. It would mean compromise, discomfort, constant navigation between cultures and expectations. It would mean being brave in ways she'd avoided for 15 years, but it would also mean waking up beside someone who challenged and cherished her, building new memories while honoring old ones, experiencing the world through eyes that saw possibility rather than limitation. Yes, she said simply. Yes, let's do this impossible, impractical, wonderful thing. Let's figure out how to make it work as we go. Because waiting for perfect clarity before taking action is just another form of fear. Rashid's relief was audible across 8,000 miles. We have 3 months left on our agreement, he said, his voice rough with emotion. But I don't want to wait anymore. Come to Dubai next month and let's start planning our actual life rather than this trial period. Let's be together, Yasmin, in all the complicated, messy, beautiful ways that means. Yasmin returned to Dubai in April, and this time the city felt different. Not a foreign mystery, but a place she might learn to call home, at least part-time. Rashid had leased a spacious apartment in Dubai Marina specifically for them to use as shared space, avoiding the complications of her staying at his primary residence before their relationship status was clearly defined. The apartment had floor-to-ceiling windows offering stunning views of the marina and the Gulf beyond, and he'd had it stocked with books in English, a proper tea service, and fresh jasmine flowers, small touches that showed his attention to what made her feel comfortable. They fell into rhythms that felt both domestic and adventurous. Mornings spent reading on the terrace with coffee, him, and tea, her. Afternoons exploring different neighborhoods or meeting with his architect about the Charleston property he was purchasing. Evenings cooking together or attending cultural events that exposed Yasmin to Emirati arts and traditions. Rashid introduced her to his friends as someone important to him, navigating the curious questions and occasional judgment from his social circle with a calm dignity that made Yasmin fall even more deeply in love with him. The cultural education went both ways. Yasmin taught Rashid about southern customs that seemed inexplicable to outsiders, the complex social protocols of church communities, the significance of particular foods at specific gatherings, the unwritten rules governing hospitality and reciprocity. He was fascinated by the subtleties she described, the ways her Charleston world operated on relationship networks and historical memory that paralleled Middle Eastern culture in unexpected ways. They visited local schools together, where Yasmin observed Arabic literature classes and compared teaching methodologies across cultures. They attended a majlis at the home of one of Rashid's business associates, where Yasmin was initially nervous about fitting in, but found herself engaged in passionate discussion about poetry with the host's wife, a literature professor who'd studied at Cambridge. These experiences taught Yasmin that she could potentially belong here, not by abandoning her identity, but by expanding it to include new understanding and appreciation. She would never become Emirati, but she could become someone who bridged cultures, who carried Charleston and Dubai in equal measure, who embodied the cross-cultural exchange she'd spent her career teaching. The real test came when Rashid accompanied Yasmin to a video call with her children, Rachel and Michael, together for the first time since Thanksgiving. Rachel, still raw from her marriage dissolution, was initially resistant to expressing support for her mother's relationship, her own pain making her cynical about love's durability. But watching Rashid interact with their mother, the way he anticipated her needs, listened completely when she spoke, treated her Opinions with genuine respect gradually softened Rachel's resistance. Michael asked pointed questions about Rashid's intentions, his business practices, his understanding of the sacrifices cross-cultural relationships required. Rashid answered with unflinching honesty, acknowledging he didn't have all answers, but was committed to figuring them out, admitting his privileged background might create blind spots, but promising to listen and learn, declaring his love for their mother with a vulnerability that clearly cost him, but which he offered anyway. By the call's end, both Carter children had given their tentative blessing, though Michael issued a brotherly warning: "You hurt our mother, and I don't care how many billions you have or how many time zones separate us, I will make you regret it." Rashid responded with equal seriousness: "If I hurt your mother, I'll regret it without any assistance from you. She deserves better than I can probably provide, but I'm going to spend whatever time I have trying to be worthy of her anyway." Rashid's purchase of a Charleston property became a joint project that revealed much about their compatibility and their differences. He wanted something grand, befitting his status and resources, something that announced his presence and his commitment. Yasmin advocated for something more modest, more in keeping with Charleston's historic character and her own values around understated elegance. Their compromise was a beautifully restored 1850s townhouse in the Ansonborough neighborhood, 4 stories of antebellum architecture with modern interior updates that preserved historical integrity while providing contemporary comfort. The house had a private courtyard garden, original heart pine floors, working fireplaces in every room, and enough space for visiting children and grandchildren without feeling palatial. Yasmin loved it immediately, the way afternoon light filtered through wavy glass windows. The history embedded in every brick, the sense of connection to Charleston's literary and artistic heritage. Rashid loved it because she loved it, and because the purchase negotiations challenged him in ways his usual business dealings didn't. Historical preservation boards, neighborhood associations, architectural review processes that couldn't be expedited with money or influence alone. Furnishing the Charleston home became an unexpected joy for both. Yasmin had Thomas's furniture in storage, pieces she couldn't bear to part with but hadn't wanted in her daily view after his death. Rashid suggested they use some of those pieces in their new home, integrating Yasmin's past into their shared future rather than demanding she leave it behind. They combined Thomas's mahogany desk with a rug Rashid had inherited from his father, placed Yasmin's grandmother's china in a cabinet next to pottery Rashid had collected in Morocco, hung family photographs from both their histories in the hallway as visual testimony to lives well lived before they found each other. The house became a physical manifestation of their relationship, respecting what each brought while creating something new together. Amira flew to Charleston for the house's completion, and Yasmin watched with joy as Rashid's daughter explored every room, her approval evident in her smile. "This feels like home," Amira declared. "Not just Charleston or Abu Dhabi, but something uniquely yours. Together, I'm so happy for you both, and I know Mama would be happy too. She always wanted Baba to find joy." The first dinner party in their Charleston home was a deliberate bridge-building event. Yasmin's children and grandchildren, her closest friends, including Margaret, and Rashid's daughter Amira, plus his oldest son, Ahmed, who'd flown in from London for the occasion. Yasmin was terrified the cultural and generational differences would create awkwardness, but Rashid's calm confidence steadied her nerves. He and Ahmed prepared a feast that combined Middle Eastern and Southern traditions: lamb makbuz, alongside she-crab soup, hummus with country ham biscuits, baklava with bourbon pecan pie. The meal became a metaphor for their relationship. Different elements that shouldn't work together, but somehow created something richer than either tradition alone. Rachel's daughters, Yasmin's teenage granddaughters, were fascinated by Ahmed and asked him endless questions about growing up in the UAE and running international business operations. Michael's son connected with Amira over their shared passion for medicine, her pediatric surgery stories fascinating the boy who hoped to become a doctor. watching her families, biological and chosen, American and Arab, past and present, blend together over food and conversation. Yasmin felt profound gratitude for the courage she'd found to embrace this impossible, beautiful life. As their first year together progressed, Yasmin and Rashid navigated the complexities of merging lives that had been independent for so long. There were moments of frustration, Rashid's tendency to solve problems with money when Yasmin valued different currencies of care, Yasmin's southern indirect communication style colliding with Rashid's preference for directness, their different relationships with time and schedules shaped by distinct cultural contexts. But they'd both lived long enough to know that frustration was the price of intimacy, that real love meant accepting someone completely rather than trying to reshape them into easier versions of themselves. They learned each other's triggers and tender places, developing private languages and rituals that marked their relationship as uniquely theirs. Rashid learned to ask, "How can I support you?" rather than immediately proposing solutions. Yasmin learned to state her needs directly rather than expecting him to intuit them through subtle signals he'd never been trained to read. The question of marriage arose organically during a conversation about estate planning. Both were wealthy enough that merging finances required legal clarity, and both had children whose inheritances deserved protection. Rashid approached it with characteristic practicality. "Would you prefer a legal marriage or a committed partnership? I'm content with either, but we should be clear about our status for both legal and cultural reasons." Yasmin appreciated his lack of romantic performance. At their age, with their histories, grand gestures felt less authentic than honest discussion. "I don't need another wedding," she said thoughtfully. "What Thomas and I had was complete, and I'm not trying to recreate that ceremony. But I think I'd like the legal and social recognition of being your wife, of having that identity that announces our commitment. Is that something you want?" Rashid reached for her hand, his grip firm and sure. "Yasmin, I would be honored to call you my wife. I never thought I'd use that word with the meaning it deserves, but you've taught me what partnership can actually be. Yes, I want to marry you, with all the legal and cultural complexity that entails." They married quietly 6 months later in Charleston, with only family present, a ceremony that honored both their traditions while creating something distinctly theirs. Yasmin wore cream rather than white, elegant simplicity that suited her age and style. Rashid wore a custom suit, but incorporated traditional Emirati elements in ways that signaled cultural pride. The ceremony was officiated by a Unitarian minister who incorporated both Christian and Islamic prayers with the couple's blessing, acknowledging that both traditions held meaning, even as the couple themselves maintained complicated relationships with their respective faiths. When Rashid slipped the ring on Yasmin's finger, a stunning sapphire, surrounded by diamonds that reminded her of Dubai's sky at twilight, and spoke his vows in both English and Arabic, Yasmin felt Thomas's presence not as competing claim, but as blessing. She'd worried about this moment, feared she'd feel guilty or disloyal, but instead she felt held by love across time. Thomas's love that had shaped her into someone capable of loving again, and Rashid's love that honored that history while creating new possibility. "I promise to honor your past while building our future," Rashid said, his voice breaking slightly. "I promise to be worthy of the trust you've given me and to love you with the fullness you deserve." Yasmin's tears flowed freely as she spoke her own vows about courage, second chances, and the beauty of unexpected paths. When they kissed, their families applauded, cultures and generations unified in witnessing love that proved life's capacity for renewal. The first year of marriage tested their commitment in ways their courtship hadn't. Living between Charleston and Abu Dhabi meant constant logistics, visa issues, shipping possessions, maintaining 2 households, the exhaustion of frequent international travel for people in their late 60s who didn't bounce back from jet lag as quickly as younger travelers. Yasmin struggled with the extended periods in Abu Dhabi, missing her grandchildren's school plays and Rachel's difficult divorce proceedings, feeling guilty about being absent during family crises. Rashid wrestled with delegating more business authority to his sons, his controlling nature warring with his commitment to be present in his marriage. They had their first serious fight 4 months into their marriage, a blow-up about scheduling that was really about deeper tensions around autonomy, identity, and the sacrifices each was making. The fight was ugly, with both saying things they regretted, but the reconciliation was revelatory. They didn't retreat into silent standoffs or defensive justifications, but instead talked through the night, excavating the real issues beneath surface complaints and finding compromise that honored both perspectives. Health challenges emerged as inevitable complications of aging. Rashid developed atrial fibrillation that required medication and lifestyle changes, forcing him to confront mortality he'd previously ignored while building his empire. Yasmin discovered precancerous cells during a routine mammogram, requiring surgery and radiation that terrified them both given Thomas's cancer death. But these challenges deepened their bond rather than straining it. Rashid accompanied Yasmin to every medical appointment, his presence both protective and vulnerable as he faced his own powerlessness in protecting her from disease. Yasmin learned to manage Rashid's medications, coordinate with his cardiologist across continents, advocate for his health when his work ethic threatened his recovery. They joked darkly about being each other's medical alert systems, but beneath the humor ran profound gratitude that they didn't face these aging challenges alone. This is what marriage really means at our age, Yasmin observed one evening, after particularly difficult doctor appointments for both. Not romance and passion, though we have that too, but showing up for each other through the unglamorous, frightening realities of bodies that don't work as well as they used to. Their relationship became example and inspiration for others navigating love later in life. Rachel, still healing from her divorce, began dating again after watching her mother's courage in embracing new partnership. "If you can be that vulnerable at 68, Rachel told Yasmin, "I can certainly risk it at 52. Several of Yasmin's Charleston friends, widows and divorcees who'd resigned themselves to permanent single status, reconsidered their assumptions after witnessing Yasmin and Rashid's evident joy. Margaret started attending singles events at the library, crediting Yasmin's example with giving her courage to try. Even Rashid's business associates noticed the transformation, his increased delegation, his better work-life balance, his evident contentment that made him more pleasant to work with, if less ruthlessly focused. Ahmed told his father during a visit to Charleston, "You've become more human, Baba. It's good. The company is actually running better. Because you're not micromanaging every decision, and you're certainly happier than I've ever seen you." Rashid accepted the observation with characteristic grace. Turns out building an empire isn't as satisfying as building a life. Who knew? The irony in his voice couldn't mask the truth beneath. He'd discovered at 69 what many never find at any age, that connection matters more than achievement, that love is the only legacy worth leaving. 2 years into their marriage, Yasmin and Rashid sat on the terrace of their Dubai apartment, watching the sun set over the Gulf in spectacular display of amber and rose that never grew old, no matter how often they witnessed it. They'd just finished a video call with all their children together, Rachel and Michael from their American locations, Ahmed and his brother Khalid from London and Abu Dhabi, and Amira from her hospital in between surgical shifts. The family had been planning a celebration for Yasmin's upcoming 70th birthday, a gathering that would bring everyone together in Charleston for a week of meals and memories. "I never imagined this," Yasmin said quietly, leaning against Rashid's shoulder with comfortable intimacy 2 years had perfected. "At 67, I thought my story was finished except for the epilogue. I thought I'd just teach until I couldn't, then slowly fade into sweet, comfortable obscurity. I never imagined falling in love again, getting married, building this beautiful, complicated life with you." Rashid wrapped his arm around her, his grip strong despite his 71 years. "I never imagined it either. I thought I'd work until I died at my desk. That achievement was the only meaning available to me. You've taught me what I was missing, even though I didn't know I was missing anything." He paused, then continued with the emotional honesty their marriage had made possible. "You know what I've learned from you? That fate isn't about predetermined destiny that strips away choice. It's about recognizing grace when it arrives unexpectedly, being brave enough to embrace possibility rather than clinging to certainty, trusting that life has more chapters than we can outline in advance. I didn't believe in fate until you proved me wrong, not because our meeting was destined, but because you taught me to be open to what I couldn't control or predict." Yasmin turned to kiss him, soft and lingering, still amazed at 69 that her body could feel desire, that attraction survived aging, that romance wasn't the exclusive province of youth. "We should write a book," she mused afterward, "about second-chance love, about the courage aging requires, about how the best stories often begin when we think the narrative is complete." They watched the last light fade from the sky, Dubai's towers igniting with electric brilliance as evening claimed the desert city. Tomorrow they'd fly to Charleston, would walk through their historic home, would prepare for the family gathering that would fill every room with laughter and life. They'd argue about something trivial and make up before bed, would read side by side in companionable silence, would fall asleep with bodies curved together in positions that felt like home, regardless of continent or time zone. In the months and years ahead, they'd face more health challenges, more complicated logistics, more moments of frustration when cultures and expectations collided. But they'd also experience more joy than either had thought possible, more growth than seemed reasonable at their ages, more love than both their previous lives combined. Their story wouldn't end in tragedy or perfect resolution. Life doesn't work that way, but it would continue with courage and commitment, with daily choices to honor both independence and connection, with the recognition that love's greatest gift isn't its conclusion, but its willingness to begin again when we least expect it. As stars emerged above Dubai's skyline, Yasmin and Rashid sat together in contented silence. Two people who'd learned that fate isn't what happens to you, but what you make possible through the courage to remain open to grace. They'd proven each other wrong about destiny, and in doing so, discovered that the most profound belief isn't in predetermined outcomes, but in love's capacity to rewrite any story when given the chance.